Good evening and welcome to the Womxn Show. I'm Lenina Rasool. Tonight we're going to be speaking about men and violence, and specifically violence in intimate partner relationships. Now, intimate partner violence and even domestic violence is often a contentious issue. And it is contentious because the perpetrators of violence are often people very close to us. It is our husbands, our fathers, our brothers, our uncles, anyone living in the house with us who we have a personal relationship with. And what's difficult there is that when violence is perpetrated, we often have two options. One is to report them to police and risk this person that we often love going to jail, or to just say nothing and have the cycle of violence continue. After the break, we'll be joined by Kerryn Rehse, who works for the organization Mosaic that works with women who are victims of violence, but also runs a program for perpetrators of violence. And the assertion is that violence is not an inherent characteristic trait. We aren't just violent by nature, but actually violence is a behavior that can be changed. Violence is a choice that you can choose not to do. But before that, let's have a look at this short video by the Medical Research Council on what it takes to raise kind boys and amazing girls.
You have to empower girls, but you have to give complementary education for boys, that they have to be egalitarian. You have to nurture this. You have to talk to them all the time that, of course, girls can do this. You have to make movies that show that girls can do anything boys. They can drive trucks, they can be superheroes, including that, of course, you can marry Joe or Jack. You're teaching them about sexuality. This kind of work is important because masculinities is more rigid than femininities. So we allow girls a little more space to play with their identities. Boys, a lot more rigid as soon as they get to a certain age, that they can't wear certain things, they can't be pushing prams, but we allow girls to play with trucks. So you have to have this complementary work about patriarchy and about attitudes around equality for boys, girls, and other genders.
So we talk about gender a lot, even with my son. He plays with dolls. They would tease him and say, "Hey, why are you playing with this? Why are you wearing this? Why are you wearing a skirt today?" I said, there's nothing wrong. If he wants to play with girls, if he wants to put on a weave, it's okay, it suits him. And if we go to the shop, if he says, "I want you to buy a doll for me," the Barbie doll with high heels, I do that. And people at the shop will say, "Hey, but why are you buying a boy this?" I said, he wants to. And I would educate them, even at the mall, say, "Listen here, if I buy this, I'm not buying this because I want him to be a lesbian or gay or what, but I'm teaching him nurturing, because he's going to be a father. So you must know that if you've got a girl, you must do certain things to a girl. You must buy pads and so on." So he's fully aware. If I ask him if I'm taking a bath, I said, "Oh, please bring me panty liner." He will know what a panty liner is. Even all of them, they know, because that's how I am. I'm open. That's the kind of relationship we have.
You have to think very hard about the work that you need to put in raising kind, generous, happy, egalitarian boy. Actually, this is a lot of work, a lot of invisible work.
How are we empowering girl children when they have to constantly be the ones to push back? And so you've got to get men, male identifying people, masculinities, to recognize how they will benefit from an egalitarian society, that they can have more engaged relationships with other men, more engaged relationships with their intimate partners, more engaged relationships, with their children. And I think this is something that we were talking about before in some of the research that we've been doing, the workshops we've been doing. There was a little boy who was playing with a shoe, and he was tying it on his back, and he was putting it to sleep, and all that kind of thing. And so our colleagues in the workshop raised the issue of whether he could have a doll. And that, that's just gone one step too feminine. But then we're surprised when young men grow up to become completely disengaged and unable to care and empathize and look after children.
The work of raising girls who are amazing, who are awesome, is a constant. It just has to happen every day. talking about it, modeling. But then if the neighbor doesn't raise boys to be like that, you have a problem. You really have a problem, because the violence is going to be there, the inequality, they just pushing back that, no, you think you're awesome, but I'm going to show you you're not awesome. You can't be walking here, you can be in this space.
I just wish I could unsee a lot of the stuff that I'm seeing and like not care, because it just makes you think too much, right? But I feel like the opposite burden, I actually don't want to have it, where I become complicit by not seeing and not caring.
So if there's inequality outside and you are this family, you're this person, what do you do with it? Do you live it forever?
What do you mean?
The inequality that you see outside, in the school, you take your kid to school and they're teaching them gender is this. This is how it is. You can't stand in this queue. You can't do this. You can't want to play soccer because soccer is only for boys. You can't do robotics. Robotics only for boys. You can't play the guitar. So they're always streaming your child. What do you do with that?
We're going to take a short break, but we'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and tonight we are speaking about men and violence, and specifically looking at violence in intimate partner relationships. And joining me is Kerryn Rehse, who is the Advocacy Policy and Research Officer at Mosaic. Kerryn, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure to be here.
So Kerryn, I'm going to start with Mosaic does counselling with perpetrators of violence. And when we spoke earlier, you were saying that the way it is approached is that violence is a behavior as opposed to a character trait. You know, we're not just inherently violent, but it's a behavior that can be changed. Tell us a bit more about that.
So, first and foremost, Mosaic's an organization that works on domestic and gender-based violence. And ultimately, we want to see a society free of all forms of violence against women and children. And when we look at that, we can't then only focus our attention on the women and children experiencing this violence. We need to look at men and boys as well. And in this instance, talking about men who use violence. And we choose those words quite specifically because we really feel that the use of violence is a choice. Now, when we look at society, we look at the way that society presumes that violence is inevitable. And rather than the exception. So it's almost normalized. And it is true that a large percentage of violence against women is perpetrated by men. But we need to look at that if this violence is a choice, then it means that it can be changed. We can't just look at men as perpetrators and label them as such. And I think society does so well at doing that, is going, men are perpetrators, they're bad.
Yeah.
So then what? Do we discard that group of men and only focus on those that don't use violence? We can't do that because then we don't break that intergenerational cycle of violence. So as an organization, we look at men use violence. It's a behavior that can be changed.
So that's very interesting because, you know, as I was saying earlier that you're saying violence is a choice. We, I think, as a society, and you see it on social media all the time, we are very unforgiving at this point. I mean, and not to say that violence is okay, but we're very unforgiving of violence and perpetrators of violence. But those perpetrators are our husbands, boyfriends, fathers, brothers, uncles, etc. So they're people we have a personal relationship with.
Yeah.
When you say violence is a choice, it's a behavior, what makes men choose to use violence?
It's a very interesting question, and a question that we get asked quite a lot as an organization. So when we look at men using violence, I think it's important that we say upfront that as Mosaic, we maintain that the man who uses violence is 100% responsible for the violence that he uses.
Yeah.
It's not, we can't say that because it's a product of socialization or toxic masculinity that it absolves them of responsibility. It's not that way at all. But we do need to look at some of those contributing factors that lead to the use of violence. And one of the things that we often don't pay attention to is the impact of very early exposure to violence, whether that be violence in the community, violence in the home. But we have to acknowledge that South Africa is quite a violent country. And we have communities that are characterized by high levels of violence. And this is where our children are growing up. And violence is seen as a normal way of communicating, a normal way of problem solving. And even if that violence is not experienced directly by the child themselves, they're seeing it. They're seeing it in their homes and their communities. So that plays a large role. But also we see harmful gender norms playing out all the way through society and our lifespan. In schools, boys are told, you need to study hard and you need to get good marks so that you can get a good job so you can provide for your family. You've got faith-based institutions saying, you're the head of the household, women are going to be submissive, you need to make the decisions. You've got families going, you need to be the protector, the provider. So what does that say to men? It's saying you have power and control over women and girls. And so these are things that feed in to the use of violence. But as I said, we can't excuse the violence because of that. It's still a choice, and the responsibility still lies with the person using that violence.
And I think maybe, I would think that's even a first step. The first time I'm thinking about violence as a choice actually within that context. And the first step is actually getting them to understand that they're choosing to use violence, because often it's just, I lost it, or you made me do it, or I don't have any control. I just want to dig in there a little bit deeper to look at the what you said. So it's often picked up when they're young. They are watching other adults, and I always like to say it doesn't necessarily mean in their own home, even in violent communities. But when I think about it, I also thought that we are not taught, or we don't see alternative healthy behaviors to deal with. It might be anger, frustration, all of those things. Is that something that you pick up in the counselling?
Most definitely. So one of the things that sticks with me so vividly is one couple that came in for counseling, and the light bulb moment for this person to change was when the counselor went through communication techniques and really went through, these are different ways that you can problem solve. These are different ways that you can resolve conflict. And it was at that point that the man in the counseling session broke down. And he said, do you mean that my mother and father did not have to be violent? That there was another way, that I've put my family through this when there was another way we could have resolved this conflict? And I think those are the things we don't always take into account when we look at men's use of violence. We go, they're doing it because they're just violent, horrible people. When often it's, as you say, you don't get exposed to alternative ways of communication.
Yeah, and it's again interesting, just going back in history, because we are also with corporal punishment, with discipline, which is often physical and violent. We are taught that this is the way to handle conflict. I wanted to ask, we've recently done some shows on bullying among learners, and what came up there is that violence is often a trauma response. And so do you see that happening as well? So when we think about, when we say violence is a behavior, we know also that anger and frustration and so forth, they are triggers, they are emotions. And women, we often, because we speak more about emotions, we talk about how we're triggered. Men don't know how to talk about, they might not even recognize that they're being triggered. Does that come up also? So past trauma that leads to violence?
Definitely. And I think that trauma is often what we see in the exposure to violence. So we look at that it's 100% true that men are responsible for their use of violence, but we also look and say that there's a large majority of men who use violence who have either been exposed to violence themselves or experienced some form of trauma in their childhood, and that then plays out in their relationships. But at the same time, we also acknowledge that there are men who are exposed to traumatic events that don't use violence. So it's just going back to that issue of responsibility, because what I don't want viewers to think or for us to do is to excuse the violence, because violence it's not an appropriate response, but it is the way that trauma plays out when there aren't services available to unpack and deal with that trauma.
Yeah, and so again, provide other healthy ways of sort of dealing with the trauma, of dealing with the feelings.
Yeah.
I also wanted to just bring in another distinction from that bullying interview that I did. The guest made a very sort of interesting point. And what he said was that bullying is different from just having a fight, in terms that it is ongoing, that it is targeted at a specific person, and that is the same person. And it resonated so with me with regard to intimate partner relationships. And I think here we're probably just sort of switching to the victim of violence, who often, doesn't see this ongoing sort of these ongoing fights as abuse. So could you just speak to, so what is domestic abuse, what is intimate partner violence and an ongoing scale, as opposed to just having a fight?
Yeah. So I think that one of the important distinctions with intimate partner violence, or gender-based violence more broadly even, is the use of power and control. It's not about the violent act per se. The violence is often used to maintain a level of power and control in that relationship. And often that comes out of someone feeling quite powerless themselves and then going, well, I'm going to have power over someone who is less powerful than I am. And using things like coercion, using threats of violence, using intimidation, and these are not things that happen once off. These are things that is a pattern of behaviors that happens within a relationship, and often from something very small. Like, no, you're not going to go see your family this weekend. Like, that seems like a non-event, but actually it's something that builds up to you being completely isolated from your family and support structure. So it's definitely a pattern of behaviors that happens over time. And that's often why a victim of violence doesn't necessarily see it as abuse, because it's happened so slowly under this guise of power and control. And then when it escalates to violence, often it's at that point that someone goes, oh, but wait, this isn't right, but maybe it's the way that it's supposed to be. And often it's someone who's experienced the same trauma that the person using the violence has experienced in their home, but experienced it from a very gendered way, is that my mom stayed, so surely this should be normal. But often it does get asked, well, why against me? Because I think often in intimate partner violence, you have one person in the relationship, the facade of the person in the relationship, but another face that is a public persona.
Yes.
Of very much, oh, but I'm this nice guy, I buy everybody everything, I'm always the one that's going to help other people. But in the home, it's very different. And if we think about the aspect of power and control, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Because who's going to believe you when you go out to say, but he's abusing me, he's physically abusing me, he's emotionally abusing me. If he's a really nice guy to me, I'm going to go like, no, I think you're imagining things. So the perfect way of power and control. But ultimately, intimate partner violence, it's not a once-off event. It's something that is targeted, as you said, but also something that happens over time, and it escalates over time.
And that's so interesting. We're seeing a lot of that, and I think there have been cases coming out. I mean, I can think of in the past 2 years where there's been sort of media exposure of domestic abuse by high-profile males, and there are two camps.
Yeah.
And the supportive camp
Yeah.
of the alleged perpetrator is very, that's exactly what they say. No, it could never be him. He is like this, and he's like this, and he's like this. Which speaks to, again, choice.
Yeah.
They're not violent against everybody or in every situation, but they are in this specific targeted situation. I want to ask you about this sort of silence. So this, the isolation, sort of the tactics or the red flags, if we want to call it that they use. It also speaks to some deep acknowledgement that what they know what they are doing is wrong. They know what they're doing is wrong because they don't want other people to know about it. Yeah. And does this also come up? So I guess I'm asking, in counselling, do you meet resistance first where they say, I'm not an abuser?
Yes.
And how do they get to this point? How do they explain that? So
it's very interesting what you say there is around that they deep down they know that what they're doing should not be seen by the outside world.
Yes.
And that also speaks to, I suppose, something we could have a whole nother conversation about is around intimate partner violence being very private violence. So therefore we don't share it. Nobody gets involved. But on the other side of the coin, but what I'm doing is not wrong. But it's also not, I don't cause this behavior. I don't choose this behavior. It's often blame shifting onto the partner, onto communities, onto society. And at the first moment when somebody comes into counselling, even if they come voluntarily, there is complete denial. I don't know why I'm here. There's no reason for me to be here. You should be working with my partner. I'm not the problem. My behavior is not a problem. I don't use violence. So very much a denial mindset. But what we do in our counseling is we work through what we call a stages of change model, where we start working within that denial, and we start working through a series of techniques to help this person start to acknowledge that actually this is my violence. I have to take responsibility for it. And only once you reach that stage can this person then start working on behavior change. And that's one of the key parts of our counseling program is we can't just go to someone who's violent and say, stop it.
Yeah.
That's not going to work. We need to really start unpacking, where does this violence stem from? And before that even, do you acknowledge that what you're doing is wrong? And that process is often the longest process. The behavior change part is quite, I don't want to say easy, but it's a lot easier once that person reaches that point to go, I'm doing this wrong, and this is how I can change it, and then start investing in that self-change.
Which speaks to really all sorts of changes. So if we look at alcoholism and drugs and smoking, also the first step is sort of admission.
Yes.
And I just want to ask, because I'm so interested also, since you do couples, so you do the counselling with the couples, what are the responses of some of the victims or survivors or the women in the relationships in relation to their partner's violence? Is there denial there as well?
So often what we find is, and maybe I can take you back just a little bit to sort of how Mosaic got involved in engaging with men who use violence, because we were often questioned, why do you do this?
Yeah.
And the very reason we did it was because beneficiaries came to us and said, we need help for our male partners. And their partners then coming forward going, we want to stop this, but we don't know how. And so we devised a program that worked in a way that we engaged both couples but separately. So we engage the female partner and the male partner separately, and we bring them together for certain things like communication.
Yeah.
It doesn't help doing communication skills separately when it's these two people that need to communicate. But then what we also did is we used the women as monitors. So they actually act as an accountability mechanism for the behavior that's used in the relationship. And this is all contracted between the partners at the time and monitored very closely by the counselor. But often we didn't see denial of the use of violence. The message that we got from our beneficiaries was very much of, we love our partner, we don't want the violence in our relationship, we need the violence to stop.
Yeah.
So they acknowledge that the violence is wrong. Where the hard work comes in is around things of isolation, manipulation, that type of violence. So the more emotional and psychological violence is often where the denial lies more than the actual physical violence. So it's really starting to unpack that.
Yes. We need to take a short break, but we'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and tonight we are speaking about men and violence, and joining us is Kerryn Rehse from the organization Mosaic that works with women who are victims of domestic abuse, who are victims of violence. And we're speaking about Mosaic's counseling program for men who use violence. And so Kerryn, just to recap a little bit, you were speaking about the program looks at violence as a behavior and violence also as a choice. So men choose to use violence as a tool in communication, and when they're feeling frustrated, but at the end of the day it is their choice to use violence to resolve whatever the problem is. And so just before the break you were speaking about this interesting thing. One of the things you use in counseling is a sort of contract between both parties, so between the man and the woman, or the man and the man, or the couple. Really, they use this, they have this contract, and the women are monitoring the behavior in some way, or monitoring whether violence happens. I mean, I really like that because it's evidence-based, because it all of a sudden takes this whole sort of mushy, abstract fights, that odd fights that we're having, and it puts it down on paper and saying these specific behaviors are problematic and hurt me and harm me, etc. What is the response to that sort of monitoring? Because I can't imagine anyone would like it, especially men. It really just brings them up close and personal, and they can't refute that these are things that happen.
So that's exactly why we integrated it into the counseling toolkit, is for what we were thinking when we were designing the toolkit was around, how do we monitor behavior change? So what we do is when a couple comes together, we do a contracting process with them where it states what the partner will be looking at and bringing back. So we didn't want a case where we were counseling men and they came back to say, no, everything's amazing. But then their partner coming back and saying, no, it's not, and there being the risk of increased violence because it wasn't spoken about beforehand. So that's why we brought it in. It was very much about somebody to go, no, but yes, you may have stopped the physical violence, but now you're using this tactic, and bringing that into the counseling session together, and then talking it through with the counselor. So it's not looked at as I'm watching you all the time, but more a way of highlighting for the individual, but these are the things that you're doing that is still very much a power and control mechanism and a use of violence. So that's why we brought it into the program, and it's something that we've seen work incredibly well, because what it does is it highlights how inherent this use of power and control is for the person who's using the violence. And what we try and do is to really bring this in at a time when the person has moved into almost the second stage of our changes,
Behavior change
model. There we go. Where they really start to consider this use of violence. So they sort of moved out of the denial phase and going, okay, maybe there's something here, and that's when it proves the most useful to go, well, this is what's happening, and that's why we brought that in, so that it's not just a one-sided affair.
Yeah.
And this violence is an interplay between two parties or more. It's not just one person using violence and the other person's just there.
No, exactly. And it's so interesting because I'm sure what it must bring up also is then expand sort of the field and understanding of what are violent behaviors. So as you're saying, the physical, you know, you might come back and say, well, I haven't hit you in like 2 weeks. But he also might not consider the fact that he's withholding money is also abusive.
Exactly.
And then that brings that up. Leading to the power and control.
Yes.
You mentioned sort of, so violent behavior and, you know, the abuse is an interplay between two parties. And let's keep it for the sake of the conversation. And I know my experience also with sort of domestic violence is that there will be an argument often that will start, there will be some violence, but then as it escalates, both parties become violent. And I think this muddies the waters also a little bit. I'm sure you must see also narrative from, well, she did that or she hit me as well. So how does that fit into sort of everything, I think?
So it really goes down to, there's a methodology that we use or ascribe to called the cycle of violence, which really looks at how do these violence incidents come to being. And that's very much what you spoke about earlier about it's not just a once-off fight. There's a cycle. There's a way that this comes into being. And often that works. You have all these little power and control mechanisms that start coming into play until the pressure builds up so much that there's this explosive event. And that's often where you see somebody retaliating almost. So something will happen, it triggers a violent response, and the partner who is the victim of this abuse also lashes out. And it becomes it's a fight or flight mechanism. So it's, I'm going to fight this because I need to protect what I can protect. So it does muddy the waters a bit, but it's also getting the couples to see, okay, why was that response in that way? And what led up to it? Because I think often what the focus is on is that violent event or that explosion, and not what the cycle that led to that happening. So it's really about unpacking that and having couples realize, okay, this might trigger something. So how do we work together to resolve that in a more positive way before it reaches this point? Because in any relationship, there's going to be arguments. But it's what does the couple do in those spaces? How do they communicate? How do they manage that conflict? It's really about teaching those very basic communication skills and conflict resolution skills.
And emotional intelligence, obviously. I mean, ultimately, it's about how do I manage these emotions that are like coursing through me right now. So often you'll find there's a period of suppression also. So let's say you can't go to you can't go visit your parents this weekend, and that is just accepted. You know, I think women especially suppress and hold in and hold in, and we actually speak about this a lot, myself and my friends. So we hold it in, hold it in, hold it in, and then there's also an explosion. To whichever mechanism of control. It's just gone on too long for a whole week or a whole month, and all of a sudden it's like. I had a woman on my show, an author, and the title of her book was "I'm Not a Fucking Mop." And that book was actually a culmination of years of abuse, of just like, I'm not a mop. You cannot just do this to me. But she had been sort of submissive about it for such a long time. And so is that sort of what you also mean when you speak about, you know, the things that are leading up to that? Women often have to speak, well, the other day he was just like, you know, he held me so tightly that there was a bruise. But it wasn't, you know, a beating. And so I let that go. And so do you find those sort of insidious behaviors that lead up to an explosion?
We do. I think you also find that for so long women are told, and society almost expects that women will just be submissive and accept the violence as normal. And if we accept the violence as normal, we are going to let it go. We're going to go, but this is the way it is. This is the way that he shows that he loves me. And often, I mean, there's been research done where women go, but if he doesn't beat me, then he doesn't love me. He's not showing love towards me. So I think there is this expectation that women do keep quiet and accept it, but at the same time, there does come a point where enough is enough, and often that is when women will stand up and fight back, and more especially if there is a threat on someone else that's close to them,
Yes.
or their children that are
Yes.
close to them.
So I want to bring
Yeah.
something in there, because I've had Mosaic court support workers on before,
Yeah.
actually, and we had, an interesting question was, so they assist women at the point of divorce, and a lot of the women that they assisted had there was domestic abuse in the
Yeah.
marriages, and one of the questions I asked was, so, broadly, what makes women leave? I mean, often they've been in these abusive relationships for such a long time, and then they do leave eventually. What is that point? And one of the court support workers said, when the children are in danger. And for me, that was interesting. One, because they're not worried about themselves being in
Yeah.
danger enough, to get themselves out of it. And two, that, that is a catalyst. So just coming in, is that also something that you see? That must come up as well. Like, I'm worried about the children.
Yeah.
And just in that also, where there are children in the relationship, do the men who use violence also understand the effect of their domestic violence on the children, whether they, hitting the children or not?
Yeah.
Do they see links there?
So the first part around women and their children,
Yeah.
Even if the children aren't having violence perpetrated against them themselves, they'll often see the effects play out in the children's behavior.
Yeah.
And that's when they start thinking, okay, this is not good. But leading up to that, again, society plays such a massive role of you can't leave that relationship. You've got to think of the children.
Yes.
And that happens across all socioeconomic status, across race, across culture. There's just this expectation that women will endure whatever they need to endure to keep the family together. And often that's the narrative that we get given by women. But my child can't grow up without a father. Or if we leave, what do we do? Because we are reliant on the income, or we're reliant on the place where we're staying. But as soon as there is a threat of violence on their children, it's okay, I become protective and I need to protect, so I will leave for that purpose. So it's definitely something we see. But when we talk about the men's use of violence and understanding the effects, I don't think there's always an understanding of the effects of that violence. I think it's very much bound up in power, the thinking of I need power and control, but I'm not hitting them, so therefore it's fine. And another case example that comes up is there was a couple, and whenever the father came home, they were twin boys, and they would go and hide under their beds because they knew if daddy came home, that's when he was going to start shouting at mommy. And when he was brought to that realization, that impacted him. It was like, so do you mean that I am now my father to my children?
Yeah.
The exact person I never wanted to be, I have become. And that was a massive turning point for this particular client. And through the process of behavior change, one of the most motivating factors for him was that his children would wait at the window for when he came home. Because that was their behavior change, to go, dad has changed, dad is good, dad is positive. So that impact of an engaged father also plays a massive role in how that violence plays out, and if it plays out at all in the home.
So this is very interesting, I think, for two reasons. So one, because we often separate domestic violence from children.
Yes.
Right? So children, and I'm often saying, I mean, especially I think when I was young and in previous years, children wouldn't even, we wouldn't even given context or told.
Yeah.
You're just literally invisible, and the next morning
Yes.
we'll wake up as if nothing had
Yes.
happened.
Yeah.
So we're not even spoken about it. And when we think about learning and we think about mirroring, how
Yeah.
children mirror. They learn by what you do, not by what
Yeah.
you say. Which brings me to my second observation. This is the second case study where it's evident that there was abuse in the home of that man when he was young, even though he didn't approve of that abuse.
Yeah.
And so I guess what it seems to say is that like this cycle is very invisible, even though that they are perpetrating violence, they're using violence, they don't link it to the violence that was used when they were young. And so is there this disconnect? Do you see this often?
We do. We see it very often. We see it in both the childhoods of men who use violence, but also of women who experience violence. That they've both, a large percentage of them have experienced some form of violence in their upbringing and violence in the home. And that's why we speak to this intergenerational cycle of violence and how violence in the home gets passed on to the next generation, and they either then become submissive and victims of violence themselves, or they become perpetrators of violence. And when we look at this, we also look at why we do this work that we do.
Yeah.
Because if we don't engage and work with these men who are using violence now, we actually are then condoning continuing that intergenerational cycle of violence.
Because their children will see it, and unconsciously, because I think it is. I think if they don't realize it, they will unconsciously continue this cycle.
Yeah.
So you were saying earlier also that research shows that men who are engaged parents are less likely to use violence in the home.
Yeah.
So that's very interesting. When you say engaged, that means playing with the kids, like being there doing homework. I mean, I actually don't. With us, it was very much like when my dad came home from work, we were fed and in our pajamas already, and we need to go to bed now.
Yeah.
And so what do you mean when you talk about sort of engaged parents?
So from a societal point, again, we look at the carers are mothers or women in community. So, it's their responsibility to change nappies, to feed children, to make sure school is done. We were talking just the other day around schools and how when schools have WhatsApp groups now, it's all the mothers that are on WhatsApp groups.
That is true.
Fathers are not encouraged to be on WhatsApp groups. And what that really says is men are seen again as these providers, or what a research study once referred to them as ATM fathers. Because they're there to hand out money and then they take a back seat.
Even if they're in the house.
Even if they live in the home. And I mean, we do have to face that in South Africa, we have 1 in 2 children that don't live in the same home as their biological father. And so those that do, the father's not engaged in a caring role, or the majority of fathers aren't. But where fathers are engaged in that very caring role, so not just a play father, but fathers that cook meals, fathers that wash dishes, fathers that change nappies or help children with their homework or in sports or anything around that and play, we find that they're less likely to use violence in the home because now they're intimately connected to the home. Where in instances where they aren't, it becomes very much of, I'm just here as this provider, as this protector. And I think one of the vulnerabilities we don't often look at in the societal context in South Africa is many men cannot protect their family. We have high levels of violence in the country. And when they can't protect or they can't provide, they fail to meet societal expectations. And if they're not intimately engaged in the family, then what is their connection to the family? So the violence is then almost separated from the impact it has on the family, and it's more about my need for power and control, and to feel what society is telling me I should feel.
Yeah, that's interesting because they feel helpless,
Yeah,
powerless.
exactly.
And I think especially in, like you're saying, very violent communities where there is a lot of violence and threat outside, that they can't do anything about.
And I think even communities that aren't necessarily violent, we're seeing, I think COVID has taught us that wealth is not infinite. So in communities that are more affluent, where people have always had access to wealth and have all of a sudden had that ripped away from them, that brings a new level of powerlessness. And very much, I need to exert this in another way. So how do I do it? I do it with my family. So there's there's different levels of how men feel powerless and how men are not able to protect or provide, but society still expects them to fulfill that and places very little value on care work. So even in instances where, you know, you see instances where there's violence where only one partner's working, and often it's the female partner, and the man then is violent because they're not fulfilling this provider role, when actually they're caring for the kids.
Yeah.
But there's no value attached to that. So it's not seen as this is my input into the household.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
That's very interesting, given that care work generally is invisible,
Yes.
is unappreciated.
Yes.
So care work done by women, that work that it takes to be in the
Exactly.
WhatsApp group
Exactly.
and put in lunch and watch the kids is often invisible. So that's a very interesting dynamic.
Yeah.
Kerryn, I think we need to take another short break.
Sure.
But we'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and we're speaking about men in violence, and we are just wrapping up our conversation with Kerryn Rehse, who is the Advocacy, Policy and Research Officer at Mosaic, an organization that assists women who are victims of abuse. And so, Kerryn, we've had this long conversation about men and violence. We've spoken about, you know, what leads to violence, some of the ways that the counselling program is, some of the things that they're using. I think I'd like to finish off the conversation and the show just by looking at what people can do at home. And I say this because I think that there is very little counselling out there for men who use violence, who don't know any other healthy way to resolve conflicts or communication. And that is part of the problem. So when we talk about violence as a behavior, what kind of interventions are used in the counseling to, one, help perpetrators of violence understand violence, and to change their behavior?
Yeah. So for the counseling itself, we really focus on techniques that can be implemented in the home. So we focus on communication techniques, but also around behavior change techniques. And that would be what to do when you feel that when you need to manage feelings of anger, frustration. And those are things that are things that just remove yourself from that explosive situation so that you don't have the violent outbursts. But ultimately, that's not something that you can also manage yourself. You need to be able to talk through the things that are leading to those behaviors. So it's really about reaching outside of the home environment. And we know that that's an incredibly fearful thing for a lot of men to do. But it's something to find someone you trust to go, I need help, and then start exploring the options.
Yes, and I think we were saying also, first step is really just admitting that I use violence. Doesn't matter what led to the violence, doesn't matter what form it took, it's just admitting, you know, sometimes I use violence. Yeah. It's not a good thing. Yeah. You know, it's harming other people. And so within that context, I mean, what message might you give to the audience? You know, whether it's women in a violent situation, it's men in a violent situation. What?
I think the most important thing is to say that help does exist. I think it's you're not alone in what you're experiencing, and Mosaic understands the difficulty that faces both women and men in coming forward and saying, I'm experiencing violence, I'm using violence. And because we have that experience, we can also very confidently say that we are here when you need to talk. And while we might not be in your community, your city, your province, we're available via phone or social media. So feel free to contact us 021 761 7585 or our website www.mosaic.org.za.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Kerryn, for joining
Absolute
us and for having
pleasure.
this conversation.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks so much.
And that brings us to the end of our show. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Lenina Rasool. Good night.